Hello and welcome back. I'm Desmond Annabrandt, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. In the previous video, we focused on designing the project itself. We discussed project details, timelines, advisors, and public engagement. In this video, we'll focus on the project narrative. The narrative is organized around three review criteria: artistic merit and quality, demand or need, and ability to accomplish. Without further ado, it's time to roll up our sleeves and get started. All right, here we are back at the dashboard page. I will go right into the application form. We have a lot to cover today. So, today we will be talking about project narrative. Make sure that you take some time to read a bit of this information at the very top. It basically just talks about what to do in the application, in this section of the application, and what not to include in your answers. Okay. Before we discuss each section, I'd like to share a few general suggestions. The project narrative is the heart of the application, right? This is where you'll have the opportunity to explain your project in greater detail and help reviewers understand why it matters, why it is needed, and why you are prepared to successfully accomplish it. One common mistake applicants make is treating the narrative as separate essays. While each criterion focuses on different aspects of the project, reviewers will still read the entire application as a whole. Strong applications are usually clear, consistent, and focused from the very beginning to the end. Another thing that I would mention is to avoid assuming that reviewers already know your work, your community, your organization, or your artistic goal. Remember that reviewers can only evaluate the information that appears in the application. So the more clearly you explain your project, the easier it is for reviewers to understand its value. It's also helpful to understand how the review criteria are weighted. Artistic merit and quality carries the greatest weight in the review process. The panelist score gets multiplied by 3. Demand or need is also important and receives additional weight. The panelist score gets multiplied by 2. And finally, ability to accomplish remains an important consideration, but carries less weight than the other two criteria. The panelist score gets multiplied by 1. So all of these numbers will be added for a total score of 30 points. Because of this, applicants should give thoughtful attention to all three sections while recognizing that not every criterion contributes equally to the final score. All right? So before we begin looking at the review criteria, I'd like to try something a little different. Throughout the rest of this video, we'll be looking at responses from 2 recent project support applications that scored very well during the most recent grant round. A special thank you and shout out to Lydia Hansen for her project Eagle Bluff Fungi Hunt and Sujin Lee for her project Jamming with the Gayagium for allowing SEMAC to use excerpts from their applications for educational purposes. So these examples come from the same application form you're completing today. Hopefully that would make this especially relevant to the questions we'll be discussing. Rather than displaying the full responses on screen, which would be difficult to read, just because some answers I would have to scroll down to read the rest of the answer. You'll find a link to a PDF containing all of today's examples linked in the description. So as we move through each review criterion, I encourage you to open the PDF, pause the video, and read that example on your own. And then also think like you are a reviewer, and then consider the prompts the applicant is responding to, what information the reviewer is trying to learn, and why you think the response received a strong score. Once you have the chance to review it, come back to the video, click play, and we'll walk through it together. Rather than focusing on the writing itself, we'll focus on how the applicant answered the prompts, what helped reviewers understand the project, and why the response was effective. We'll then repeat the same exercise with a second example. My hope is that by comparing two very different approaches, you'll see that there isn't one correct way to respond to these questions. Instead, you'll gain a better understanding of how successful applicants use the prompts to tell a clear, cohesive story throughout their application. Now, let's take a closer look at the first review criteria: artistic merit and quality. The first review criterion is the artistic merit and quality, and this section carries the greatest weight. So take your time to read through these three things with three questions under them. Through your responses, reviewers begin to learn about your creative practice, your artistic goals, what motivates your work, and why this project is important to you at this point in your development. They're looking at both the project and the person proposing it. As you respond to these questions, think about how the project fits into your larger creative journey. Why are you the right person to do this work? Why is this project important? Why is this project important right now? How does it help you grow, explore something new, deepen your practice, or take the next step in your artistic development? The strongest responses often help reviewers understand not only what the project is, but also why it matters to the person creating it. All right. Now, let's take a look at the first example. So I'm going to pause the video. I recommend you pausing the video right here to read the first example, and then we'll regroup to talk about our takeaway from the first example. All right, now that you've had the chance to read the first example written by Sujin, let's talk about what stood out to me. One of the first things I noticed is that by the end of the response, I have a very clear picture of the entire project. I understand what participants will experience, what the public engagement components looks like, and how all of the activities connect together. At no point did I feel like I had to fill in missing pieces myself. Another strength of this response is how naturally the different prompts build upon one another. As I moved through the narrative, it never felt like the applicant was answering one question after another. Instead, the response flows as a cohesive story. Information introduced earlier is often expanded upon later, so reviewers are constantly building a deeper understanding of the project rather than starting over with each new prompt. I also noticed that Sujin rarely makes broad statements without explaining them. For example, rather than simply saying she wants to share Korean traditional music, she explains what participants will actually experience, how they'll engage with the art form, and why that approach is important to her artistic practice. That gives reviewers enough information to understand not only what she is proposing, but why she's proposing it. Finally, notice how closely connected the different parts of the application are. Her artistic goals, public engagement plans, venue selection, and community impact all reinforce one another. Nothing feels disconnected or added simply because the application asks for it. Instead, every section contributes to the same overall story, making it much easier for reviewers to understand the project as a whole. Okay, now let's look at example number 2 made by Lydia Hansen. And let's pause the video right now. All right. Although the project is completely different, I noticed many of the same strengths. One thing that stood out immediately is the level of detail throughout the response. Rather than speaking in general terms, Lydia consistently provides enough detail for reviewers to understand exactly what she's proposing. Whether she's describing the artwork, the artistic techniques she'll be developing, or the public engagement activities, reviewers rarely have to guess what she means. Another thing I appreciated is how she connects the project to her broader artistic practice. Instead of presenting this as a standalone project, she explains how it builds upon previous work while continuing to move her artistic practice forward. That helps reviewer understand why this project is an appropriate next step rather than an isolated idea. I also think Lydia does an excellent job of helping reviewers understand why each part of the project was designed the way it was. Rather than simply naming Eagle Bluff as the venue or listing public engagement activities, she explains why those decisions strengthen the project and support its goals. Throughout the response, the reasoning behind her choices is just as clear as the choices themselves. Finally, notice how every section supports the others. The artistic vision, community need, public engagement, partnerships, and venue all point toward the same overall project. By the time reviewers finish reading, they aren't just evaluating individual answers, they have a clear understanding of the proposal as a whole. Now, here is my general takeaway. These two responses take very different approaches. I think they share three qualities that are worth remembering as you prepare your own application. First, both applicants make it easy for reviewers to understand the project. They provide enough detail, context, and explanation that reviewers rarely have to guess what they mean or fill in missing information themselves. Second, both applicants treat the application as one connected story rather than a series of unrelated questions. Each response builds upon the previous one, so by the end of this section, reviewers have a complete understanding of the artistic vision, the project, and why it matters. Finally, both applicants consistently explain the reasoning behind their decisions. They don't simply describe what they plan to do, they help reviewers understand why those choices make sense for this particular project. That's especially important for artistic merit and quality because reviewers aren't just evaluating your idea, they're evaluating the strength of the artistic vision behind it. As you prepare your own application, remember that every response in this section should help reviewers understand your project a little more clearly than the response before it. By the end of the artistic merit and quality section, reviewers should have a complete, coherent, and compelling understanding of both your project and your artistic vision. Okay, let's move on to the second criterion, demand or need. Again, take your time to read these 3 points with the questions under it. Um, the second criterion here, when reviewers read this section, they're trying to understand why this project is important and who it serves. In other words, why does this project need to happen? Who benefits from it? What opportunities does it create? What gap, interest, challenge, or need does it address? One common misunderstanding is that applicants feel they need to identify a major problem or crisis in order to demonstrate need. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes a strong demand or need response identifies something that is missing, underrepresented, requested by the community, or simply an opportunity that would not otherwise exist. Reviewers are often looking for a clear connection between the project you're proposing and the people who will benefit from it. Another common mistake is focusing only on the artist. While your own artistic development may absolutely be part of the need, reviewers are often looking for a broader picture as well. How does this project benefit participants, audiences, collaborators, or the community? Let's look at how two applicants answered those questions. So, let's look at the third example made by Sujin, and I recommend you pausing the video right now. All right, so now that you've had a chance to read Sujin's response, let's talk about what stood out to me. One thing I noticed immediately is that Sujin doesn't rely on broad statements about why her project is important. Instead, she explains where the need comes from. Throughout the response, reviewers can see how her experience performing and teaching Korean traditional music led her to recognize a gap between audience interests and opportunities for meaningful participation. Another strength is that she approaches the idea of need from several perspectives. She explains why the project is important to her own artistic development, why it benefits participants, and how it contributes to the broader community. As a reviewer, I never feel like I'm looking at just one person's opinion. The need is considered from multiple points of view, and that is great. I also appreciate that she doesn't try to convince reviewers that her project is completely unique. Instead, she explains what makes her approach different and why that difference matters. That honestly helps reviewers understand the project's value without relying on exaggerated claims. By the end of the response, I have a clear understanding not only of what need the project addresses, but also why the applicant believes this project is the right response to that need. Okay? Now, let's look at the fourth example. This is an example made by Lydia, and I recommend you pausing the video right here. All right, we're back. Although her project is very different, I notice many of the same strengths. One thing that stands out is how much evidence she provides to support her statements. Rather than simply saying there is interest in the project, she draws upon previous installations, audience feedback, attendance, and partnerships to demonstrate that interest. Reviewers don't have to assume there is community demand because she shows where that understanding comes from. I also appreciate how naturally she connects her own artistic goals with community benefit. Throughout the response, it becomes clear that the project isn't only helping her grow as an artist, it also creates educational opportunities, encourages environmental curiosity, and supports the mission of her project partner. Another thing I noticed is that Lydia consistently explains why the project was designed the way it was. Whether she's discussing the location, the activities, or the intended audiences, reviewers can see the reasoning behind those decisions rather than simply reading a list of project components. By the end of the response, reviewers have a strong understanding of both the need for the project and the thought process that shaped it. All right. The general takeaway, in my opinion, these two responses are very different, but they share one important quality. Neither applicant expects reviewers to simply agree that the project is needed. Instead, they help reviewers understand how they arrive at that conclusion. Both applicants draw from their own experiences, observations, previous work, and community connections to explain why this project is worth doing. Rather than making broad claims, they provide enough context and reasoning for reviewers to reach that conclusion alongside them. As you prepare your own application, remember that this criterion isn't about convincing reviewers that your project is important. It's about helping reviewers understand why you believe there is a need for your project, who it serves, and how you've come to that understanding. By the end of this section, reviewers should feel confident that the need you've identified is thoughtful, well supported, and clearly connected to the project you're proposing. All right, so let's scroll down to the next criterion, ability to accomplish. Again, take your time to read these 3 points with 3 questions under them. This is the final review criterion, and it focuses on your ability to successfully complete the project you've proposed. All right. So at this point in the application, reviewers already understand your project, why it's needed, and who will benefit from it. Now they're asking a different question. Can this applicant realistically accomplish everything they've proposed? This criterion gives you an opportunity to answer that question by explaining your planning process, your artistic development, and your plans for publicizing the project. All right, now we're going to look at example number 5. This is an example made by Sujin Lee, and we'll regroup after you review the example. And I recommend you pausing the video right now. All right, now that you've had a chance to read Sujin's response, Let's talk about what stood out to me. One thing I noticed immediately is that this response gives reviewers confidence that the project has been thoughtfully planned. Rather than simply saying she'll complete the project, Sujin walks reviewers through how she intends to accomplish it, from planning and purchasing materials to confirming venues, preparing the workshops, and carrying out the public activities. By the end of the response, reviewers have a clear sense of how the project will move from an idea to reality. I also appreciate how naturally she discusses the people involved in the project rather than mentioning collaborators or advisors simply because the application asks about them. She explains the role each person will play and why their involvement strengthens the project. This helps reviewers understand that support has been thoughtfully considered rather than added as an afterthought. Another strength is that Sujin is realistic about the project's scope. She doesn't try to make the project sound bigger than it is. Instead, she proposes a project that is ambitious enough to support her artistic growth while remaining achievable within the timeline, budget, and resources she has available. By the end of the response, I have confidence not only that Sujin has a good idea, but that she has a realistic plan for successfully carrying it out. All right, now let's have a look at example number 6, written by Lydia Hansen. I recommend you pausing the video right now. Okay, like Sujin, Lydia gives reviewers confidence that she can accomplish the project, but she does so in a different way. One thing that stood out to me is how much planning had already taken place before the application was submitted. Throughout the response, reviewers can see that project partners have been identified, installation locations have been considered, timelines have been developed, and the overall logistics have been carefully thought through. That preparation naturally builds confidence in the proposal. I also appreciate how Lydia builds upon previous experience without relying on it alone. Rather than simply saying she's completed similar projects before, she explains how those experiences prepared her for this next step, while also identifying the next techniques, partnerships, and challenges she'll be taking on. That balance is important because reviewers are looking for projects that are both achievable and capable of moving an artist's practice forward. Finally, I noticed that the publicity, partnerships, timeline, and evaluation methods all reinforce one another. Nothing feels disconnected. Instead, each part of the response helps reviewers understand not only what will happen, but how the applicant intends to make it happen successfully. By the end of the response, reviewers aren't simply trusting the applicant's confidence, they've been shown enough planning, preparation, and reasoning to feel confident themselves. By the end of the response, reviewers aren't simply trusting the applicant's confidence, they've been shown enough planning, preparation, and reasoning to feel confident themselves. So, the general takeaway for this last criterion, these two responses approach the criterion differently, but they share one important quality. Both help reviewers feel confident that the project can be successfully accomplished. Neither applicant simply says they're capable of completing their work. Instead, they demonstrate that capability through thoughtful planning, realistic timelines, appropriate partnerships, and clear explanations of how the project will move from concept to completion. As you prepare your own application, remember that reviewers are looking for evidence, not reassurance. Okay? The more clearly you explain your planning process, the reasoning behind your decisions, and how each part of the project fits together, the more confidence reviewers will have in your ability to successfully accomplish what you've proposed. All right, so we have discussed the three criteria for the project narrative section. We've reviewed examples for each criterion. I hope that was useful. There is another text box under here, additional information option. If you have any additional information that you think a reviewer would benefit from reading it, please make use of this text box. The two examples that we reviewed together today, they did not use the additional information option, so I do not have an example, but you can kind of see why they didn't need this section just because of how much they were able to include in each text box at the top there. So yeah, we have reviewed everything. I hope this was useful. Yeah, that is all for the project narrative. At this point, you've completed the project narrative section of the application. You've explained what you're proposing to do, why the project matters, who it serves, and how you're prepared to successfully accomplish the work. The narrative is where reviewers often gain their clearest understanding of both the project and the artist or culture bearer behind it. Before moving on, I encourage you to read your narrative as a whole and ask yourself a few questions. Can someone unfamiliar with my work understand what I'm proposing? Have I clearly explained why this project is important right now? Have I demonstrated the need for the project and who it will serve? Have I provided enough information for reviewers to feel confident that I can accomplish what I'm proposing? If the answer to those questions is yes, you're likely in a strong position to move forward. In the next video, we'll focus on the spending plan and discuss how to build a budget that supports the story you've already told throughout your application. If you have any question, feel free to contact me. Again, I'm Desmond Annabran, Grant Programs Manager here at Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council. Call me on 507-281-4848 or email me at staff@semac.org. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.